On a sweltering August afternoon in 1897, the ledger was discovered by pure accident when a fire swept through the east wing of the Crane Mansion in Fort Wayne, Indiana. As servants frantically carried valuables from the burning structure, one stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind what appeared to be an ordinary bookshelf. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting in 3 distinct columns: names, dates, and locations. But these weren't business records or family genealogies. The first column listed over 400 names of men, women, and children who had simply vanished from the surrounding counties over the past 15 years. The second column recorded their dates of acquisition. The third, most chilling of all, marked their dates of death with a single word: processed. The servant who found it would later claim that the journal reeked of something metallic and foul, something that reminded him of the steel foundries down by the river. Local authorities quickly confiscated the evidence, and within days, the investigation was mysteriously closed. For 3 years, the truth about Bartholomew Crane remained buried beneath layers of wealth, influence, and fear. Before we continue with the story of America's most disturbing family dynasty, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers across the nation. What happened next would shake the very foundations of the Gilded Age's most celebrated success story, revealing how one man's insatiable appetites led to horrors that would make even the darkest chapters of American history pale in comparison. Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the 1880s was a city drunk on the promise of progress. Steam engines thundered through its railroad yards day and night, carrying the raw materials that would forge America's industrial future. At the heart of this transformation stood the Crane Steel Works, a sprawling complex of furnaces and workshops that employed nearly 3,000 men and produced some of the finest steel west of Pittsburgh. The man who built this empire was as impressive as his industrial achievements. Bartholomew Crane stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall with piercing blue eyes and prematurely silver hair that only enhanced his aristocratic bearing. Born to a modest farming family in Ohio, he had transformed himself through sheer force of will into one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest. By 1885, at the age of 38, he owned not just the steel works, but also vast tracts of farmland, 3 smaller factories, and a railroad line that connected Fort Wayne to Chicago. His personal worth was estimated at over $2 million, a fortune that placed him among the industrial royalty of his era. But it wasn't just Crane's wealth that made him a legend throughout Indiana and beyond. It was his extraordinary approach to marriage and family that set tongues wagging from Indianapolis to Detroit. Unlike the secretive polygamists of the Utah territories, Crane made no attempt to hide his unconventional domestic arrangements. He openly maintained what he called his extended family, multiple wives and dozens of children spread across several magnificent properties. The centerpiece of his empire was Crane Manor, a 40-room mansion that dominated a hill overlooking the Maumee River. Built in the Gothic Revival style with towers that seemed to scrape the Indiana sky, the manor housed what locals called the primary family, 7 wives and 23 children who lived together in apparent harmony. Each wife had her own wing of the house, complete with private sitting rooms and nurseries for her children. The arrangement was formalized through what Crane called spiritual matrimony contracts, documents that gave each woman legal protection and financial security in exchange for their exclusive devotion to the family unit. Beyond the manor, Crane maintained 6 additional properties throughout Allen County. These smaller estates, each worth a fortune in their own right, housed his secondary families, women who had chosen to live more private lives while still bearing his children and sharing in his prosperity. The Willowbrook Farm, 20 miles south of Fort Wayne, was home to 5 wives and their 16 children. Riverside House, a stately mansion near the St. Mary's River, sheltered 4 wives and 12 children. Each property was a world unto itself, staffed with servants, tutors, and governesses who ensured that Crane's offspring received the finest education money could buy. The most remarkable aspect of these arrangements was how openly they were conducted. Crane appeared at social functions with different wives, attended church services with various combinations of his children, and regularly threw lavish parties where members of all his families mingled freely. Fort Wayne society, initially scandalized, gradually came to accept and even admire the sophisticated way Crane managed his complex domestic life. His wives were elegant, well-educated women who seemed genuinely content with their situation. His children were polite, well-dressed, and academically accomplished. Newspaper society pages regularly featured the Crane family's activities. The Fort Wayne Gazette wrote glowing profiles of Crane's wives, describing their charitable work and cultural contributions to the city. The Indianapolis Star published interviews with several of his older children, praising their academic achievements and social graces. Even religious leaders, after initial hesitation, began to view Crane's arrangements as a unique form of Christian charity, providing security and purpose to women who might otherwise have remained spinsters in an age when marriage prospects were limited. Local businessmen admired Crane not just for his industrial success, but for his apparent ability to maintain harmony among so many strong-willed women. They would joke at their men's clubs about his diplomatic skills and his talent for organization. Some even consulted him for advice on managing their own single-wife households. Crane would smile graciously at such conversations, often remarking that his secret was simple: treat each woman as if she were the only woman in the world, and she will reward you with loyalty beyond measure. Behind the public facade of domestic bliss, however, there were subtle signs that all was not as perfect as it appeared. Several of Crane's wives, when pressed by journalists, would mention certain areas of the manor that were off-limits to family members. They spoke of mysterious nighttime deliveries to the estate, of strangers who came and went at odd hours, of sections of the basement that were kept perpetually locked. When asked about these peculiarities, the wives would quickly change the subject, their faces clouding with what seemed like fear rather than mere discretion. The children, too, occasionally let slip comments that suggested a darker undercurrent to their privileged lives. Crane's 10-year-old son, Edmund, once told a playmate that his father had a special place where bad people went to learn how to be good. 12-year-old Margaret Crane mentioned to her tutor that she sometimes heard sad singing coming from beneath the floor of the manor's library. When adults questioned these children about their statements, they would become confused and claim they couldn't remember what they had said. Most disturbing of all were the observations made by servants and workers on the Crane properties. Several housemaids reported finding blood stains on clothing that came down from the manor's restricted areas. Groundskeepers mentioned strange tools and equipment being delivered to basement entrances that seemed to have no legitimate household purpose. Kitchen staff noticed that enormous quantities of food were being prepared daily, far more than could be consumed by the known residents of the estate. Yet no official guests were ever announced. The women themselves, despite their apparent contentment, exhibited behaviors that suggested a deep-seated anxiety. They rarely traveled alone, even to nearby Fort Wayne. They seemed reluctant to discuss their lives before joining the Crane family. Most tellingly, none of them had any contact with their families of origin, a fact that Crane explained by claiming that his wives had all been orphans or estranged from relatives who disapproved of their unconventional lifestyle. By 1890, Bartholomew Crane's reputation as both an industrial genius and a master of domestic harmony was secure throughout the Midwest. Visitors came from as far as New York and California to see his steel works and to observe his unique family arrangements. He was frequently mentioned in newspapers as a possible candidate for governor of Indiana, with editorials praising his innovative approaches to both business and family life. The future seemed boundless for the man who had seemingly solved the eternal problems of loneliness and want by simply ignoring conventional limitations. Yet even as his public star rose higher, whispers began to circulate in the immigrant neighborhoods of Fort Wayne and in the hobo camps along the railroad lines. Stories of people who had sought work at the Crane Steel Works and had simply vanished. Tales of mysterious figures who prowled the poorest sections of the city, making offers that seemed too good to be true. Reports of families who had answered advertisements for domestic positions at the Crane estates and had never been seen again. These whispers might have remained just that, the paranoid fantasies of society's most vulnerable members, if not for what happened on a rain-soaked evening in October 1890, when the first crack appeared in Bartholomew Crane's carefully constructed empire of prosperity and desire. The autumn of 1890 brought an unprecedented labor shortage to Fort Wayne's industrial district. The economic boom that had swept through the Midwest created more jobs than there were workers to fill them, and factory owners found themselves competing fiercely for skilled laborers. This made what was happening at the Crane Steel Works all the more puzzling. Unlike his competitors, Crane never seemed to struggle with staffing his factories. While other industrialists offered signing bonuses and increased wages to attract workers, Crane's workforce appeared to replenish itself effortlessly. New faces appeared regularly in his foundries and workshops, men who worked with quiet efficiency and seemed content with wages that were actually below the area's standard rates. When questioned about his recruitment methods, Crane would smile and explain that his reputation for fair treatment attracted the finest workers from across the region. The truth, however, was far more complex and infinitely more sinister. Thomas O'Brien had been a foreman at the Crane Steelworks for 8 years when he first noticed the peculiar patterns in worker attendance. Unlike other factories where employees built relationships and formed social groups, Crane's workforce seemed strangely transient. Men would appear for their shifts, work with mechanical efficiency, and then simply disappear after a few weeks or months. O'Brien initially attributed this to the harsh conditions of steel work, assuming that inexperienced laborists were simply moving on to easier jobs. But as he began keeping informal records, O'Brien realized that the disappearances followed no logical pattern. Some of the men who vanished were his most skilled workers, immigrants from Germany and Ireland who had years of foundry experience and should have been eager to establish permanent employment. Others were strong young men from local farming families who had specifically sought steady work to support wives and children. Most disturbing of all, several of the disappeared workers had been known to O'Brien personally, men who had spoken of their plans to bring their families to Fort Wayne, who had been saving money for houses, who had shown every sign of wanting to build permanent lives in the area. O'Brien's growing unease deepened when he attempted to trace some of these missing workers. When he visited the boarding houses where they had lived, he discovered that their rooms had been cleaned out completely, as if they had never existed. When he inquired at the railroad station about tickets purchased by these men, clerks claimed to have no record of their travel. Most mysteriously, when O'Brien tried to contact the families of local workers who had vanished, he found that their relatives had received carefully written letters explaining that the men had found better opportunities in distant cities and would send for their loved ones once they were established. The letters were convincing in their details and seemed to reflect genuine knowledge of each man's background and personality. Yet something about them troubled O'Brien. The handwriting, while different in each case, showed subtle similarities that suggested they might have been written by the same person attempting to disguise their penmanship. More disturbing still, several of the letters contained information that the workers themselves had never shared publicly, intimate details about family histories and personal dreams that they had only discussed during private conversations with O'Brien himself. Determined to solve the mystery, O'Brien began conducting his own investigation. He started arriving at the steelworks before dawn and staying after sunset, observing the comings and goings of both workers and management. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. During the pre-dawn hours, when the night shift was ending and the day shift had not yet begun, O'Brien witnessed a series of activities that were never recorded in the factory's official logs. Horse-drawn wagons would arrive at a rear entrance to the facility, their drivers muffled in heavy coats despite the mild autumn weather. These wagons carried what appeared to be groups of people, men, women, and even children, who moved with the stumbling gait of those who were either extremely exhausted or under the influence of some substance. The newcomers would be led directly into a section of the steel works that O'Brien had always assumed contained storage facilities for raw materials. But as he watched night after night, he realized that people who entered this area during the pre-dawn deliveries never emerged during regular working hours. Instead, different individuals would appear in the main foundries, men who bore little resemblance to those who had been brought in the wagons, but who somehow possessed the same work clothes and carried the same lunch pails. O'Brien's investigation took a terrifying turn when he decided to follow one of the mysterious wagons. On a moonless night in November, he shadowed a wagon that left the steel works at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning. The wagon traveled not toward any of Fort Wayne's residential areas, but deep into the countryside along routes that O'Brien had never explored. After an hour of careful pursuit, the wagon turned onto a private road that led directly to Crane Manor. Hidden behind a grove of oak trees, O'Brien watched as the wagon was unloaded at a basement entrance to the mansion. The cargo consisted of approximately a dozen individuals who moved with the same strange, listless gait he had observed at the steel works. But these were not the rough working men he had expected. Instead, he saw well-dressed women, elderly couples, and several children. All appeared to be unconscious or severely drugged, requiring assistance to walk from the wagon to the basement entrance. Most shocking of all, O'Brien recognized one of the women being carried into the mansion. She was Catherine MacLeod, the young widow of a Scottish immigrant who had worked briefly at the steel foundry before his mysterious disappearance 6 months earlier. Catherine had been searching frantically for her husband, visiting the factory weekly to ask if anyone had word of his whereabouts. Now she was being carried unconscious into the basement of Bartholomew Crane's family estate. O'Brien realized with growing horror that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than simple labor recruitment. The people being brought to Crane Manor were not willing workers seeking employment. They were victims of what could only be described as organized kidnapping. The operation was clearly sophisticated, involving multiple locations and numerous accomplices, and it had been operating for years without detection. The next morning, O'Brien attempted to report his discoveries to the local sheriff, but found himself facing an unexpected obstacle. Sheriff William Hendricks, a rotund man who had held his position for over a decade, listened to O'Brien's account with growing irritation rather than concern. When O'Brien finished his story, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and fixed him with a stern glare. "Thomas O'Brien," the sheriff said slowly, "you're talking about one of the most respected men in Indiana. Bartholomew Crane employs half this county and contributes more to our local charities than any other businessman. Are you seriously suggesting that he's involved in kidnapping?" O'Brien insisted on the truth of what he had witnessed, offering to lead the sheriff to the locations where he had observed the suspicious activities. But Hendricks refused to authorize any investigation, claiming that O'Brien's allegations were the ravings of a man who'd been working too hard and drinking too much. When O'Brien persisted, the sheriff threatened to have him arrested for public intoxication and disturbing the peace. Frustrated but not deterred, O'Brien next attempted to interest the local newspaper in his story. The editor of the Fort Wayne Gazette, however, proved even less receptive than the sheriff. After listening politely to O'Brien's account, the editor explained that his newspaper depended heavily on advertising revenue from Crane's various businesses. Publishing unsubstantiated allegations against such an important advertiser would be financial suicide for the publication. O'Brien found himself trapped in a web of economic dependency that made exposing Crane's activities nearly impossible. Every institution in Fort Wayne, law enforcement, the press, local government, even the churches, relied on Crane's financial support. The steel magnate had cleverly positioned himself as indispensable to the community's prosperity, creating a situation where challenging him meant challenging the economic foundation of the entire region. But O'Brien was not the only person who had begun to notice disturbing patterns in Crane's operations. Sister Margaret O'Connell, who ran the Catholic orphanage on the east side of Fort Wayne, had been keeping her own informal records of missing persons. Over the past 2 years, she had received numerous inquiries from families searching for relatives who had disappeared while seeking work or housing in the Fort Wayne area. Sister Margaret's records revealed a pattern that was even more disturbing than what O'Brien had discovered. The missing persons included not just working-age men, but entire families who had answered advertisements for domestic positions at various Crane properties. These families had supposedly been hired for positions such as groundskeepers, housekeepers, and tutors, but once they reported for work, they seemed to vanish completely. The Nun had attempted to visit several of the Crane estates to inquire about these missing families, but had been turned away by security guards who claimed that the families in question had moved on to other opportunities. When Sister Margaret persisted in her inquiries, she received a visit from Crane himself, who arrived at the orphanage with a generous donation and a gentle but firm suggestion that her time might be better spent caring for the children under her charge rather than pursuing unfounded concerns about my household staff. The donation was substantial enough to fund the orphanage's operations for an entire year, and it came with the implicit understanding that Sister Margaret's questions about missing families should cease. Faced with the choice between pursuing her investigation and ensuring the survival of the institution that cared for dozens of homeless children, the Nun reluctantly accepted Crane's terms. By the spring of 1891, a conspiracy of silence had settled over Fort Wayne like a suffocating blanket. Those who had witnessed or suspected Crane's criminal activities found themselves isolated and powerless, trapped by their own economic vulnerability and the community's unwillingness to challenge its most important benefactor. The missing persons continued to disappear. The mysterious wagon deliveries continued under cover of darkness. And Bartholomew Crane's reputation as a pillar of the community remained unmarred. But beneath the surface of this enforced quiet, pressure was building. O'Brien continued his nocturnal surveillance, documenting everything he observed in a detailed journal that he kept hidden in his boarding house room. Sister Margaret maintained her records of missing families, searching for patterns that might eventually provide proof of wrongdoing. Most significantly, several of Crane's own wives had begun to ask uncomfortable questions about the activities they observed within their own homes. The facade of perfect domestic harmony that had made Crane famous throughout the Midwest was beginning to show cracks, and those cracks would soon widen into fissures that would expose the horrifying truth about America's most celebrated family man. The autumn of 1891 brought subtle but significant changes to the atmosphere within Crane Manor. The wives who had once moved through the mansion's corridors with the confidence of women secure in their privileged positions now seemed to walk more carefully, speaking in hushed tones and casting nervous glances toward the areas of the house that remained perpetually off-limits to family members. Eleanora Hartwell had been Crane's first wife, married to him in a simple ceremony in 1878 when he was still a struggling steel worker with ambitions far beyond his circumstances. Over the 13 years of their marriage, she had watched him transform from a charming but poor suitor into one of the most powerful men in Indiana. She had also watched him accumulate additional wives with the same methodical approach he applied to acquiring steel foundries and railroad shares. Eleanora's position as the senior wife gave her certain privileges and responsibilities within the complex hierarchy of the Crane household. She managed the domestic staff, coordinated the education of the children, and served as Crane's official hostess for social functions. These responsibilities also gave her access to information that the other wives did not possess. And by 1891, that information was causing her considerable distress. The household account books, which Eleanora reviewed monthly, revealed expenses that made no sense in the context of their known family activities. Enormous quantities of food were being purchased weekly, enough to feed a population 3 times the size of their actual household. Medical supplies were being ordered in quantities that suggested someone was operating a small hospital within the manor. Most puzzling of all, substantial payments were being made to individuals whose names Eleanora did not recognize and whose services were never explained. When Eleanora questioned Crane about these mysterious expenses, he would smile and explain that his business interests required him to maintain facilities for visiting associates and that some of his steelworks employees received medical care through a private clinic he had established. The explanations were plausible, but they didn't account for the scale of the expenditures Eleanora was seeing, nor did they explain why these facilities were never mentioned in any of Crane's public statements about his charitable activities. Eleanora's concerns deepened when she began to notice changes in the behavior of the household staff. Several longtime servants had recently been replaced with new employees who seemed unusually nervous and secretive. These new servants worked different shifts from the regular staff, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, and they were specifically assigned to maintain the restricted areas of the mansion that family members were forbidden to enter. Most troubling of all, Eleanora began to hear sounds from the basement areas that she could not identify or explain. Late at night, when the manor was supposedly quiet and all family members were asleep, she would hear what sounded like machinery operating in the depths of the building. Sometimes there were voices, not the familiar tones of family members or regular servants, but strangers speaking in languages she could not identify. Occasionally, she heard what sounded like crying or pleading, sounds so faint that she couldn't be certain they were real. Eleanora attempted to share her concerns with the other senior wives, but found that they too had noticed disturbing changes in their household routine. Margaret Sullivan, Crane's third wife, reported that her youngest children had been having nightmares about sad people who lived in the walls of the house. Victoria Welsh, his fifth wife, mentioned that her teenage daughter had claimed to see unfamiliar faces looking out of windows in sections of the manor that were supposed to be unoccupied. The wives began meeting secretly in Eleanora's sitting room to discuss their observations and concerns. What they discovered during these clandestine conversations painted a picture of systematic deception that stretched back years. Each wife had noticed different pieces of a larger puzzle, mysterious deliveries, unexplained absences by their husband, strange smells emanating from certain areas of the house, and the presence of people who seemed to live within the manor but were never introduced to the family. Their investigation took a frightening turn when Margaret Sullivan discovered a hidden passageway behind a bookshelf in the manor's library. The passageway led to a narrow staircase that descended far deeper into the building than any of the wives had realized was possible. Following the staircase required considerable courage, but Margaret's determination to understand what was happening in her own home drove her to explore further. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door that was secured with multiple locks, but Margaret could hear sounds coming from beyond the door that confirmed her worst fears. There were definitely people on the other side, numerous people, including children, and they were clearly in distress. The sounds included weeping, coughing, and what seemed to be weak calls for help. Most chilling of all, Margaret could hear the sound of machinery that seemed to be operating continuously, accompanied by the rhythmic striking of metal that suggested some kind of manufacturing process was taking place in the basement areas. When Margaret reported her discovery to the other wives, they faced a terrible dilemma. They had uncovered evidence that their husband was keeping people prisoner beneath their own home. But they had no way to prove their suspicions without confronting Crane directly. Such a confrontation would not only end their privileged lives, but could also put them and their children in serious danger if Crane was indeed capable of the criminal activities they suspected. Their decision was made for them when 7-year-old Timothy Crane, Eleanora's youngest son, disappeared for several hours one afternoon in December 1891. The boy had been playing in the manor's west wing when he simply vanished, causing panic among the family and servants. He was eventually found sleeping in his own bed with no memory of where he had been or how he had gotten there. But Timothy's disappearance was accompanied by disturbing details that suggested he had been deliberately taken and returned. His clothes, which had been clean when he vanished, were now dirty and smelled of the same metallic odor that the wives had noticed in certain areas of the manor. More frightening still, Timothy had developed a severe cough and complained of a sore throat, symptoms that suggested he had been exposed to smoke or chemical fumes. When Eleanora questioned her son about his missing hours, Timothy became agitated and began speaking about the working people downstairs and the sad place where nobody can leave. He described seeing lots and lots of people in a big room and hearing the loud banging sounds that never stop. Most disturbing of all, Timothy claimed that someone had told him he was going to learn about the family business, but that he had been returned to his room because he was too little to understand. Eleanora realized that her son had somehow gained access to the hidden areas of the manor and had witnessed whatever activities Crane was conducting in the basement levels. The fact that Timothy had been drugged or otherwise made to forget his experience suggested that Crane was willing to use chemical substances even on his own children to protect his secrets. The wives' growing knowledge of their husband's criminal activities put them in an increasingly precarious position. They could not go to the authorities because Crane's influence in Fort Wayne made any official investigation unlikely. They could not simply leave because Crane controlled all of their financial resources and had legal custody of their children. Most terrifyingly, they now understood that they were living directly above what appeared to be a prison where dozens of people were being held against their will. Their situation became even more dangerous when Crane began to display signs that he suspected his wives were investigating his activities. He started asking pointed questions about their daily routines, checking on their whereabouts more frequently, and assigning specific servants to monitor their activities. The atmosphere within the manor became increasingly tense as the wives tried to maintain the facade of domestic happiness while knowing that their own husband was a criminal of the worst possible type. The breaking point came in January 1892 when Margaret Sullivan discovered something that confirmed their worst fears about Crane's activities and revealed the true scope of his horrifying operations. Hidden behind a loose floorboard in her bedroom, she found a collection of personal belongings that had obviously been taken from numerous different people, jewelry, photographs, letters, and identification documents that told the stories of dozens of individuals who had vanished from the Fort Wayne area over the past several years. Among these items, Margaret found a letter that chilled her to the bone. It was addressed to Catherine MacLeod, the Scottish widow whose husband had disappeared from the steel works, and it contained her desperate plea to the Fort Wayne sheriff for help in finding her missing spouse. The letter was dated only 3 weeks before Margaret herself had seen Catherine being carried unconscious into the manor's basement. Margaret realized that she and the other wives were not just living with a criminal. They were living with a man who was systematically kidnapping, imprisoning, and possibly murdering innocent people. The beautiful mansion that had been their sanctuary was actually the headquarters of a criminal organization that preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. But even this horrifying discovery was not the worst revelation awaiting the wives of Bartholomew Crane. The true scope of his operations and the ultimate fate of his victims would only be revealed when one of their own number decided to risk everything to expose the monster they had unknowingly married and the nightmare that existed beneath their very feet. Rebecca Fleming had always been different from Crane's other wives. A former teacher from Chicago who had married him in 1889, she possessed an analytical mind and a fierce independence that had attracted Crane initially, but now seemed to make him increasingly uncomfortable. Unlike the other wives who had gradually accepted the restrictions and mysteries of life at Crane Manor, Rebecca continued to ask questions and seek answers to the inconsistencies she observed in their household. Her opportunity to uncover the truth came in February 1892 when Crane departed for a business trip to Pittsburgh that was expected to last 2 weeks. For the first time since her arrival at the manor, Rebecca found herself with extended periods when her movements were not closely monitored by her husband or his specially assigned servants. Rebecca had been quietly studying the layout of the manor for months, paying particular attention to the architectural inconsistencies that suggested the existence of hidden spaces and passages. The building's original construction had been completed in 1883, but substantial additions and modifications had been made over the following years. These modifications seemed designed not just to accommodate Crane's growing family, but to create concealed areas that could serve purposes unknown to the manor's official residents. Using her knowledge of building construction gained from her late father, who had been an architect, Rebecca began to map the manor's hidden geography. She discovered that the basement level extended far beyond what was visible from the main house, incorporating what appeared to be a network of underground chambers that connected not only to different sections of the manor, but also to external structures on the estate grounds. Her exploration began in the early morning hours when the rest of the household was still asleep. Following the passage that Margaret Sullivan had discovered behind the library bookshelf, Rebecca descended the narrow staircase to the locked door at its base. But instead of attempting to open that door, she continued her exploration of the surrounding area and discovered additional passages that provided alternative routes into the underground complex. What Rebecca found beyond those passages would haunt her for the rest of her life. The basement level of Crane Manor was not a single large space, but rather a labyrinth of interconnected chambers that had been converted into what could only be described as an underground factory. The rooms contained industrial equipment, including small-scale steel furnaces, metalworking tools, and machinery for processing raw materials. But the most horrifying aspect of these facilities was not their equipment. It was their workforce. Dozens of people were imprisoned in the basement chambers, living and working in conditions that defied human decency. Men, women, and children were chained to workstations where they operated the machinery that produced steel components and finished goods. They worked in shifts that lasted 18 to 20 hours with brief rest periods spent sleeping on straw mattresses that were laid directly on the stone floors. The prisoners appeared to represent a cross-section of Fort Wayne's missing persons, immigrant families, traveling workers, homeless individuals, and even some locally known people who had supposedly left town for opportunities elsewhere. They were kept compliant through a combination of physical restraints, inadequate nutrition, and what appeared to be regular doses of laudanum or some other sedative substance that left them docile and confused. Rebecca realized that she was witnessing the source of Crane's spectacular business success. While his competitors struggled with labor costs and worker strikes, Crane had solved these problems by creating a slave workforce that cost him nothing beyond the expense of kidnapping and imprisoning his victims. The steel products that had made him famous throughout the Midwest were being manufactured by people who had been stolen from their families and forced to work until they died of exhaustion or disease. But the underground complex contained horrors that went beyond even slave labor. In the deepest chambers of the facility, Rebecca discovered what Crane did with prisoners who became too sick or weak to continue working. These individuals were not released or given medical care. They were killed and their bodies were disposed of through a process that explained the most disturbing aspect of Crane's business operations. The final chamber in the underground complex contained a large furnace that was designed not for steel production, but for the incineration of human remains. Bodies of deceased prisoners were fed into this furnace where they were completely destroyed except for the mineral content of their bones. This mineral residue was then processed and mixed with the raw materials used in steel production, meaning that the metal product sold by Crane Steel Works literally contained the remains of his victims. Rebecca's discovery explained the superior quality of Crane's steel products, which had puzzled competitors who couldn't understand how he achieved such consistent results with seemingly standard raw materials. The addition of human bone ash to his steel production process created alloys that were stronger and more durable than conventional products, giving Crane a significant competitive advantage in the marketplace. The realization that she had been living above this charnel house for 3 years, sleeping peacefully while dozens of people suffered and died beneath her feet, filled Rebecca with a horror so profound that she initially questioned her own sanity. The man she had married, who had courted her with poetry and flowers, who played gently with his children and spoke eloquently about building a better future for America, was revealed to be a monster whose crimes surpassed anything she had ever imagined possible. But Rebecca's horror was matched by her determination to expose Crane's activities and rescue his victims. She spent the remaining days of his absence documenting everything she had discovered, creating detailed maps of the underground complex and compiling lists of the prisoners she had observed. She also began planning a way to alert authorities outside of Fort Wayne, recognizing that Crane's local influence made it impossible to seek help from the town's law enforcement or government officials. Her plans were complicated by the realization that she could not act alone. The underground complex was too heavily guarded and too well secured for a single person to liberate the prisoners. Moreover, any rescue attempt would need to be coordinated with outside assistance to ensure that the victims could be safely removed from Crane's property and provided with protection from his inevitable retaliation. Rebecca's investigation also revealed the full scope of Crane's criminal organization. The kidnapping operations that supplied victims to his underground factory were coordinated through a network of accomplices that included corrupt law enforcement officers, unscrupulous business associates, and criminals who specialized in human trafficking. The operation extended beyond Indiana to include procurement networks in Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan, making it a multi-state criminal enterprise of unprecedented scale. Most chilling of all, Rebecca discovered evidence that Crane's activities were not merely the result of greed or business ambition. Hidden among his personal papers, she found journals that revealed his philosophical justification for his crimes. Crane viewed himself as a pioneer of industrial efficiency, someone who had discovered how to eliminate the wasteful aspects of human labor by reducing workers to their most essential function, the production of goods. His writings revealed a man who had gradually lost all sense of human empathy and morality, someone who saw other people as nothing more than components in an industrial process. He wrote extensively about his plans to expand his operations, establishing similar facilities in other cities and eventually creating a nationwide network of hidden factories powered by enslaved workers. Rebecca realized that Crane's crimes represented not just individual acts of murder and kidnapping, but a systematic attempt to reduce human beings to the level of industrial machinery. His success in Fort Wayne was merely the first step in a plan that could potentially destroy thousands of lives across the entire country. When Crane returned from his business trip, Rebecca was waiting for him with a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone trapped in the nightmare he had created beneath their feet. The final confrontation between husband and wife would expose the full extent of his horrifying empire and set in motion events that would shake the foundations of Fort Wayne's most powerful family. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Crane Manor intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Rebecca finally confronts the monster she married. Crane returned from Pittsburgh on a cold February evening in 1892, his carriage wheels crunching through the snow that had fallen during his absence. Rebecca watched from her bedroom window as he stepped down from the vehicle, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight, his bearing as confident and aristocratic as ever. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he had always seemed, a successful businessman returning home to his loving family after a profitable trip. Only Rebecca knew that she was watching a predator return to his hunting grounds. She had spent his absence not only documenting his crimes, but also wrestling with the terrible knowledge of what kind of man she had shared a bed with for 3 years. The charming conversations they had enjoyed, the intimate moments they had shared, the future they had planned together, all of it had been a lie, a performance by a man who was capable of unspeakable cruelty toward his fellow human beings. Rebecca had decided that she could not continue living this deception. The moral weight of her knowledge combined with the ongoing suffering of the prisoners beneath her feet made it impossible for her to maintain the facade of domestic happiness. She would confront Crane with her discoveries and demand that he release his victims immediately. If he refused, she was prepared to take whatever action was necessary to expose his crimes, regardless of the personal consequences. The confrontation took place in Crane's private study, a richly appointed room lined with law books and business documents that had always symbolized his success and respectability. Rebecca waited until the rest of the household had retired for the evening, then knocked softly on the study door. When Crane invited her to enter, she found him seated behind his mahogany desk, reviewing correspondence from his Pittsburgh meetings. "Bartholomew," she began, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "We need to discuss what you've been doing in the basement of this house." Crane looked up from his papers with an expression of mild curiosity, as if Rebecca had asked about the weather or the evening's dinner menu. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, my dear. The basement contains storage facilities for the household. Nothing that should concern you." Rebecca had anticipated his denials and was prepared with specific details that would make further deception impossible. "I've seen the prisoners, Bartholomew. I've seen the factory equipment and the furnace where you burn their bodies. I know about the kidnapping network and the steel production that's made you rich. I know everything." For a moment, Crane's facade of polite confusion remained in place. Then slowly, his expression began to change. The warm smile faded from his lips, and his eyes grew cold and calculating. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone that Rebecca had never heard before, flat, emotionless, and utterly devoid of human warmth. "You've been a very busy woman during my absence," he said quietly. "I underestimated your curiosity. That was a mistake I won't make again." Rebecca felt a chill of pure terror run down her spine as she realized that the man sitting across from her was no longer bothering to maintain his pretense of humanity. The mask had finally slipped, revealing something far more dangerous than she had imagined. But she forced herself to continue with the confrontation that she knew might be her only chance to save the prisoners and expose Crane's crimes. "Those people downstairs have families who are searching for them," she said. "They have children who don't understand why their parents never came home. You have to let them go, Bartholomew. You have to end this nightmare." Crane leaned back in his chair and regarded her with the same dispassionate interest he might show toward a particularly challenging business problem. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Rebecca. Those people serve an important function in my operations. They represent a solution to the fundamental inefficiencies of conventional labor practices. To release them would be counterproductive." The clinical way he referred to human beings as efficiency problems revealed the depth of his moral corruption. Rebecca realized that she was not arguing with someone who had temporarily lost his way, but with a person who had fundamentally rejected the basic principles of human decency. "They're people, Bartholomew," she said desperately. "They are not machinery or raw materials. They have souls. They have hopes and dreams and people who love them. How can you treat them as if they're nothing more than tools for your factories?" Crane's response chilled her to the bone. "Hope and dreams are luxuries that interfere with productivity. Love is a weakness that prevents people from accepting their proper role in industrial society. I've simply eliminated these inefficiencies from my workforce. The results speak for themselves. My steel is superior to anything produced by conventional methods." Rebecca understood that rational argument would not reach a man who had so completely abandoned his humanity. She changed her approach, appealing to his self-interest rather than his conscience. "The authorities will discover what you're doing eventually. Someone will notice the missing people. Someone will investigate the unusual success of your business. When that happens, you'll lose everything. Your fortune, your reputation, your freedom. Is it really worth the risk?" Crane smiled at her question, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The authorities in Fort Wayne are well compensated for their discretion. The business community benefits too greatly from my success to ask uncomfortable questions. And the victims I select are chosen specifically because they won't be missed. Immigrants without connections, homeless individuals, families with no local ties. I've been operating for over 5 years without detection. I see no reason why that should change. The casual way he discussed the selection of victims revealed the systematic nature of his crimes. This was not a man who had stumbled into criminal behavior, but someone who had carefully planned and executed a campaign of kidnapping and murder that spanned years. Rebecca realized that negotiation and persuasion would accomplish nothing with such a person. "I won't be part of this," she declared. "I'm going to leave this house tonight and I'm going to contact federal authorities who aren't under your influence. I'm going to make sure that everyone knows what you've been doing." Crane's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made Rebecca suddenly aware of how isolated and vulnerable she was. They were alone in the study. The rest of the household was asleep and she was confronting a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to imprison and murder innocent people. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Crane said softly. "You've seen too much, learned too much. I can't allow you to leave this house with the knowledge you've acquired." Rebecca felt panic rising in her chest as she realized that her confrontation with Crane had been a terrible mistake. She had assumed that her status as his wife would provide some protection, that even a man capable of such crimes would hesitate to harm someone he had claimed to love. But she now understood that Crane was incapable of genuine love or attachment, that she was no safer than any of his other victims. "The other wives know what I've discovered," she said quickly, hoping to deter him with the threat of additional witnesses. "Eleonora and Margaret and Victoria all know about the prisoners. If something happens to me, they'll go to the authorities." Crane considered this information with the same clinical detachment he had shown throughout their conversation. "That's unfortunate," he said finally. "I had hoped to avoid complications with the rest of my family, but if they've become security risks, then adjustments will need to be made." The implication of his words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. He was not only planning to silence her, but he was prepared to murder his other wives and possibly even his own children to protect his criminal operations. The man she had married was not just a criminal. He was a monster who would destroy anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire of suffering and death. Rebecca realized that her only chance of survival lay in immediate escape. She had to reach the outside world and alert authorities who were beyond Crane's influence before he could implement whatever plan he was developing to silence her and the other wives. But as she turned toward the study door, she discovered that her options for escape had already been eliminated. Standing in the doorway were two men she had never seen before, both wearing the rough clothes of factory workers, but carrying themselves with the alertness of professional guards. Their presence confirmed that Crane had anticipated this confrontation and had prepared for the possibility that his wife might become a threat to his operations. "Rebecca," Crane said calmly, "I'd like you to meet two of my most trusted associates. They're going to help you relocate to a part of the house where you'll be more comfortable and where we can continue our discussion without interruption." She understood that relocation meant imprisonment and that any further discussion would likely involve torture designed to extract information about what she had told the other wives. The realization that she was about to become another victim of the monster she had married filled her with a despair so profound that for a moment she considered simply surrendering to whatever fate awaited her. But then she thought about the dozens of prisoners suffering in the basement chambers, about the families who were still searching for their missing loved ones, about the other victims who would be kidnapped and murdered if Crane's operations continued. Her personal fate mattered less than stopping the systematic destruction of innocent lives that was taking place beneath the respectable facade of Crane Manor. With a sudden burst of desperate courage, Rebecca lunged toward the study window, hoping to break the glass and alert the outside world to what was happening inside the manor. But the guards moved faster than she did, grabbing her arms and preventing her escape. As they dragged her from the study, she managed one final defiant act that would ultimately prove more significant than either she or Crane realized at the time. Hidden in the folds of her dress was the detailed map she had drawn of the underground complex along with the list of prisoners she had observed and the evidence she had gathered about Crane's criminal organization. As the guards pulled her toward the door, she managed to drop these documents behind Crane's desk where they fell into a gap between the desk and the wall. Neither Crane nor his guards noticed her action, and the documents would remain hidden in that location for months, waiting to be discovered by someone who could use them to expose the truth about America's most celebrated family man and his empire of human suffering. As Rebecca was dragged from the study toward her own imprisonment in the basement chambers she had discovered, she could hear Crane already making plans for dealing with his other wives. The nightmare that had begun with the kidnapping of strangers was about to expand to include his own family. And the respectable facade of Crane Manor was about to crumble under the weight of crimes that defied human comprehension. The transformation of Crane Manor from a symbol of domestic harmony into a fortress of terror began immediately after Rebecca's confrontation with her husband. Within hours of her disappearance into the basement chambers, Crane had implemented security measures that effectively turned his estate into a prison for his remaining wives and children. The other wives awoke the next morning to find armed guards stationed throughout the mansion, men who claimed to be providing enhanced security due to recent threats against the family. These guards, drawn from the same criminal network that had supplied Crane with kidnapping victims, made it clear that no family member would be allowed to leave the estate without Crane's explicit permission. Eleanora Hartwell, as the senior wife, attempted to inquire about Rebecca's whereabouts, but was told that Rebecca had been taken ill during the night and was receiving medical treatment in a private facility. When Eleanora pressed for more details, she was politely but firmly informed that further questions about Rebecca's condition would not be welcome. The wives quickly realized that they had become prisoners in their own home. Their movements within the manor were restricted to specific areas. Their correspondence was monitored and their interactions with servants were closely supervised. Most ominously, their children were separated from them under the pretense of providing specialized tutoring, but were actually being held as hostages to ensure their mother's cooperation. Crane himself seemed to have undergone a complete transformation. The charming, attentive husband they had known was replaced by a cold, calculating man who regarded them with the same clinical detachment he had shown toward his kidnapping victims. During the few occasions when he spoke to them, he made it clear that their continued well-being depended entirely on their willingness to maintain absolute silence about anything they might have observed or suspected regarding his business activities. The atmosphere of fear that now permeated the manor was intensified by sounds that drifted up from the basement levels, sounds that suggested the prisoners below were being subjected to increased brutality. The wives could hear screaming that lasted for hours, the noise of machinery operating at maximum capacity, and what sounded like construction work as Crane apparently expanded his underground facilities to accommodate additional victims. But even as Crane tightened his control over his family and his criminal operations, forces beyond his influence were beginning to converge on Fort Wayne. The systematic disappearance of so many people over such an extended period had finally attracted the attention of federal investigators who were not subject to local corruption and political influence. Special Agent Daniel Kowalski of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation had been tracking reports of missing persons across multiple states when he noticed the unusual concentration of disappearances in the Fort Wayne area. Unlike local law enforcement officials who had dismissed these reports as isolated incidents, Kowalski recognized the pattern of an organized criminal enterprise that was operating on a scale unprecedented in American history. Kowalski's investigation had been initiated by a letter from Sister Margaret O'Connell, who had finally overcome her fear of Crane's retaliation and had written to federal authorities detailing her concerns about the missing families. The nun's detailed records of disappeared persons, combined with similar reports from other cities, provided Kowalski with evidence of a criminal network that extended across state lines and therefore fell under federal jurisdiction. The federal investigation gained momentum when Kowalski was contacted by Thomas O'Brien, the steel works foreman, who had been conducting his own surveillance of Crane's activities. O'Brien's detailed journal of suspicious activities at the steel foundry, combined with his eyewitness account of mysterious deliveries to Crane Manor, provided federal agents with specific evidence of criminal activity that could justify a formal investigation. Most significantly, Kowalski's investigation received crucial assistance from an unexpected source, Dr. Harrison Payton, the physician who had been treating some of Crane's workers for unusual injuries and illnesses. Dr. Payton had been puzzled by the medical conditions he observed in patients referred to him by Crane's businesses, injuries that were consistent with prolonged confinement and malnutrition, symptoms of chemical poisoning that suggested exposure to industrial processes, and psychological trauma that indicated severe abuse. When Dr. Payton learned about the federal investigation, he provided Kowalski with medical records that documented the systematic abuse of workers in Crane's facilities. These records, combined with the other evidence gathered by federal agents, established probable cause for a comprehensive investigation of Crane's business operations and personal property. The federal raid on Crane Manor took place on March 15, 1892, just 3 weeks after Rebecca's confrontation with her husband. Federal agents, accompanied by military personnel from Fort Benjamin Harrison, surrounded the estate before dawn and secured all entrances to prevent the destruction of evidence or the escape of criminal suspects. Crane himself was arrested in his study, where agents found him calmly destroying business documents that detailed his criminal operations. His attempt to eliminate evidence was only partially successful, however, as federal agents had prepared for such tactics and moved quickly to secure the most important areas of the estate. The discovery of the underground complex beneath Crane Manor shocked even the experienced federal agents who had seen the worst of American criminal activity. The scope of the operation, the number of victims, the sophistication of the facilities, the systematic nature of the abuse exceeded anything in their previous experience. When they found the furnace used for disposing of human remains, several agents became physically ill at the realization of what they were witnessing. The rescue of the surviving prisoners became a massive humanitarian operation that required medical personnel, social workers, and interpreters who could communicate with victims from dozens of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Many of the prisoners were so psychologically damaged by their ordeal that they could not immediately comprehend that they were being rescued. Others were so physically weakened by malnutrition and abuse that they required immediate hospitalization. Among the prisoners rescued from the basement chambers was Rebecca Fleming, who had survived 3 weeks of imprisonment by maintaining her sanity through the hope that someone would eventually discover the truth about Crane's operations. Her testimony, combined with the document she had hidden behind Crane's desk, provided federal investigators with detailed evidence of the scope and methods of his criminal enterprise. The investigation of Crane's activities revealed the full extent of his crimes against humanity. Over the course of 5 years, he had been responsible for the kidnapping and imprisonment of more than 400 people. Of these victims, fewer than 100 survived to be rescued. The remainder had died from exhaustion, disease, industrial accidents, or deliberate murder when they became too weak to continue working. The trial of Bartholomew Crane became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the testimony of dozens of survivors, the physical evidence from his underground facilities, and the detailed records he had kept of his criminal activities. The prosecution presented a case that revealed not just individual acts of murder and kidnapping, but a systematic attempt to reduce human beings to the status of industrial equipment. Crane's defense attorney attempted to argue that his client was insane, that no rational person could have conceived and executed such horrific crimes, but the extensive planning and sophisticated organization of Crane's operations demonstrated a calculating intelligence that made claims of insanity impossible to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Bartholomew Crane was executed by hanging on November 3, 1892 in the yard of the Indiana State Prison. He showed no remorse for his crimes and made no statement beyond a brief comment that his methods would eventually be recognized as pioneering contributions to industrial efficiency. Even in death, he remained convinced that his reduction of human beings to manufacturing components represented progress rather than an abomination against human dignity. The surviving wives and children of Bartholomew Crane faced their own challenges in the aftermath of his execution. Although they were cleared of any involvement in his crimes, they bore the burden of having lived unknowingly above one of the worst criminal enterprises in American history. Several of the wives, including Eleanora Hartwell, changed their names and relocated to distant states where they could start new lives free from the shadow of their husband's infamy. Rebecca Fleming, whose courage in confronting Crane had been instrumental in exposing his crimes, became an advocate for the rights of kidnapping victims and worked with federal authorities to improve methods for investigating organized criminal activity. She never remarried, dedicating the remainder of her life to ensuring that the suffering of Crane's victims would not be forgotten. The Crane Steel Works was permanently closed, and the manor that had housed his criminal operations was demolished by order of the federal court. The site was eventually converted into a memorial garden where the names of Crane's victims were engraved on stone markers, creating a permanent reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrial ambition and moral corruption. The case of Bartholomew Crane fundamentally changed American understanding of organized crime and industrial abuse. It led to new federal laws governing labor practices, strengthened penalties for kidnapping and human trafficking, and established procedures for federal investigation of crimes that crossed state boundaries. The Bureau of Investigation, which had played a crucial role in exposing Crane's activities, was expanded and given additional resources to combat similar criminal enterprises. Perhaps most importantly, the Crane case served as a warning about the dangers of allowing economic success and social respectability to shield criminal activity from scrutiny. The fact that such horrific crimes could be committed by a man who was celebrated as a pillar of his community demonstrated the need for constant vigilance against those who would exploit society's most vulnerable members. The legacy of Bartholomew Crane's crimes continues to resonate through American history as a reminder that true evil often hides behind a facade of respectability and success. His story stands as testament to the courage of individuals like Rebecca Fleming, Thomas O'Brien, and Sister Margaret O'Connell, who risked everything to expose the truth and save innocent lives. This mystery shows us that even in America's gilded age of prosperity and progress, the darkness of human cruelty could flourish in the shadows of respectability. The steel magnate who seemed to have everything, wealth, power, and the perfect family, was revealed to be a monster whose crimes defied comprehension. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such systematic evil could exist without detection for so long? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on how ordinary people can stand against extraordinary evil. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.